There comes a moment when you finally get tired, not of people, but of proving your worth to people who already decided not to see it. You stop explaining. You stop double texting. You stop wondering why someone suddenly became distant, why their energy changed, why you're always the one trying to keep the connection alive. And something strange happens. When you stop chasing, your mind gets quiet, not empty, quiet. You begin to notice how much of your energy was being wasted trying to control things that were never yours to control. You were checking who cared, who replied, who noticed, who remembered, who came back. You were measuring your value through somebody else's attention, and you didn't even realize how expensive that habit was. But the day you stop chasing people, you start chasing something else, your peace, your discipline, your goals, your own respect. And suddenly, silence doesn't feel like rejection anymore. It feels like freedom. You realize that not every person who walks away needs to be followed, and not every closed door needs to be kicked open. Some people leave because their chapter with you is finished. Some connections disappear because you were holding onto them long after they stopped serving you. And that's when your mindset begins to change. You stop asking, how do I make them stay? You start asking, why was I begging someone to stay in the first place? That question changes everything. Because when you truly understand your value, you don't need to convince anyone of it. You don't need to perform for attention. You don't need to become louder just because someone became colder. You don't need to chase people who are perfectly comfortable watching you run after them. The moment you stop chasing people, something inside you becomes disturbingly clear. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because you finally stop running long enough to see what was happening while you were distracted. You were so busy trying to hold certain people close that you never noticed how far they had already moved away. You were sending the message first, starting the conversation, explaining yourself, apologizing when you weren't even wrong, trying to fix moods you didn't create, trying to maintain connections that only survived because you kept breathing life into them. And then one day you stop. No dramatic announcement, no angry speech, no final paragraph explaining how disappointed you are. You simply stop giving unlimited access to your attention. That silence feels strange at first because your mind has become addicted to pursuit. You wonder whether they noticed. You wonder whether they will message. You wonder whether they are talking about you. You wonder whether you should break the silence just to make sure everything is okay. But you don't, and that is where the transformation begins. Because when you stop chasing, you start seeing patterns instead of excuses. You notice who only contacted you when they needed something. You notice who disappeared whenever you stopped making the effort. You notice who remembered your existence only when you became useful. You notice who expected your attention but rarely offered theirs. You notice how many times you confused familiarity with genuine connection. That realization can hurt, but sometimes pain is simply truth arriving without permission. You begin understanding that attention is not the same thing as respect. Someone replying to you does not automatically mean they value you. Someone missing you does not necessarily mean they appreciate you. Someone returning after ignoring you does not mean you have to open the door again. You start becoming more selective. Not cruel, not arrogant, selective. There is a difference. You no longer feel responsible for keeping every relationship alive. You stop treating every change in someone's behavior like an emergency. If someone becomes distant, you don't immediately panic. If someone stops talking, you don't automatically assume you did something wrong. If someone chooses another direction, you don't destroy your dignity trying to drag them back. You let their decision belong to them, and yours belong to you. That is where your mind becomes dangerous in the healthiest possible way. You stop reacting to every little signal. You stop allowing someone else's mood to determine your entire day. You stop checking your phone every few minutes, hoping for a notification that might temporarily make you feel important. Your attention returns to you. And once your attention returns to you, your life starts looking different. You begin noticing the goals you abandoned while trying to impress people. You remember the projects you delayed because you were emotionally distracted. You realize how much time disappeared inside conversations that never went anywhere. Suddenly, solitude doesn't look like punishment. It looks like space. Space to think, space to rebuild, space to become someone who no longer needs constant validation to feel secure. And this is where people misunderstand the power of walking away. They think walking away means you stopped caring. Sometimes it means you finally started caring about yourself. You can still love someone and refuse to chase them. You can still miss someone and refuse to beg. You can still remember someone and refuse to return to the same cycle. That is maturity. You stop confusing attachment with loyalty. You stop confusing desperation with love. You stop confusing persistence with strength, because real strength isn't always holding on tighter. Sometimes real strength is releasing your grip and discovering that your hands were never supposed to carry another person's unwillingness. There is a strange kind of power that appears when you stop needing people to notice you. Not the loud kind, not the kind that demands attention or walks into a room trying to prove something. It is quieter than that, colder, more controlled. You stop performing for reactions, and suddenly you begin seeing how much of your life was built around getting them. You used to wonder who was watching, who noticed your absence, who saw your progress, who cared that you stopped talking, who was waiting for you to come back. But eventually, you realize something almost uncomfortable. The more you chase attention, the more power you hand away. Every time you desperately seek someone's approval, you're telling your mind that their reaction matters more than your own judgment. Every time you check whether someone viewed your message, liked your post, replied to your words, or acknowledged your effort, you're allowing someone else's behavior to decide whether you feel valuable. And that is a terrible way to live, because people are unpredictable. Today they praise you. Tomorrow they ignore you. Today they call you important. Tomorrow they act like they barely remember your name. If your confidence depends on that kind of unstable attention, then your emotional state will always be controlled by someone else. So you stop. You don't announce it. You don't make a performance out of becoming distant. You simply stop reaching for reactions. You start keeping certain victories private. You stop explaining every decision. You stop telling everyone what you're planning. You stop trying to convince people that you're changing. You just change, quietly. And something interesting happens when you become comfortable with silence. People's behavior becomes easier to read. You don't have to interrogate anyone. You don't have to manipulate anyone. You don't have to create some dramatic test to discover who cares. Just stop doing all the work. Watch what happens. Who reaches out? Who checks on you? Who remembers you without needing something? Who only appears when you become useful? Silence doesn't create these answers. It reveals them. And that can be uncomfortable, because sometimes the person you thought would notice your absence doesn't notice at all. That's where most people break. They panic. They send another message. They create another excuse. They chase another conversation. They tell themselves, maybe they are just busy. Maybe they are. But sometimes the answer is simpler than the story you're creating in your head. They aren't choosing you, and you don't need to hate them for that. You simply need to stop abandoning yourself because they did. Your silence isn't punishment. It isn't revenge. It isn't a strategy designed to make someone jealous. It is self-control. You are saying, I don't need to force a connection that doesn't naturally exist. That sentence alone can change your entire mindset, because now your energy becomes yours again. You start investing it into your body, your work, your goals, your discipline, your future. You start becoming interested in your own life again, instead of constantly monitoring someone else's behavior. And eventually, attention loses its grip on you. Someone compliments you, and you appreciate it without becoming addicted to it. Someone ignores you, and you continue your day. Someone leaves, and you grieve without destroying yourself. Someone returns, and you don't automatically open the door just because they knocked. You begin understanding that access to you should not be automatic. Your peace becomes more valuable than temporary attention. Your dignity becomes more important than being noticed. Your silence becomes less about what other people might think and more about what you finally understand. You don't need everyone to hear you. You don't need everyone to understand you. You don't need everyone to stay. And when you finally become comfortable with that reality, you stop chasing attention, because you discover something far more valuable than being noticed. There comes a point where you realize that begging someone to stay is not love anymore. It is fear wearing the costume of love. You keep reaching out because you are terrified of what their absence might mean. You keep explaining because you think one perfect explanation will suddenly make them understand your value. You keep giving chances because you believe the next chance will finally produce the version of them you wanted all along. And while you're busy trying to keep them, you're quietly losing yourself. You tolerate disrespect because you don't want conflict. You accept inconsistent behavior because you don't want to seem demanding. You forgive things that still hurt because you're afraid that setting a boundary might make them leave. You become smaller just to keep someone comfortable. Then you call it loyalty. No. Sometimes loyalty without self-respect becomes self-abandonment. The moment you stop begging for connection, something inside you stands back up. You begin recognizing the difference between wanting someone and needing them to validate you. You can miss someone without chasing them. You can care without constantly proving it. You can love someone without making their presence the foundation of your identity. That is where self-respect begins. Self-respect is not walking around believing you're better than everyone else. It is knowing you don't have to become less than yourself just to be accepted. You stop negotiating with people who repeatedly show you that they don't value your effort. You stop asking, "What do I need to do so they choose me?" Instead, you ask, "Why am I trying so hard to convince someone to see what I already know about myself?" That question hits differently, because once you genuinely respect yourself, rejection doesn't have the same power anymore. It can hurt. Of course it can hurt. You're human. But pain doesn't automatically become permission to chase. You don't turn someone's decision into a personal verdict about your worth. Someone can reject your presence without defining your value. Someone can misunderstand you without making you worthless. Someone can walk away without taking your future with them. And that is the mindset shift most people never make. They think self-respect means becoming emotionless. It doesn't. You can feel everything and still maintain your standards. You can cry and still walk away. You can miss them and still refuse to send the message. You can remember the good moments and still recognize that the relationship is no longer good for you. You don't need to turn someone into a villain just because you decided to stop chasing them. You simply stop participating in a dynamic that keeps damaging your peace. There is something powerful about no longer needing to prove that you deserve basic consideration. You don't beg for replies. You don't demand attention. You don't compete with other people for someone's affection. You don't perform your pain, hoping they'll finally understand what they lost. You let reality speak for itself. If they value you, their actions will eventually reveal it. If they don't, your chasing was never going to manufacture genuine respect. And once you understand that, you become harder to manipulate. Not because you're trying to control anyone. Because you're no longer willing to betray yourself for temporary closeness. Your standards become clearer. Your boundaries become stronger. Your choices become calmer. You stop accepting crumbs simply because you once experienced hunger. You stop celebrating the bare minimum because you're afraid there won't be anything else. You stop confusing someone's occasional attention with consistent care. And suddenly, being alone doesn't feel as terrifying. You realize that loneliness is sometimes uncomfortable, but living constantly rejected inside a relationship can be even more exhausting. You would rather face an empty room than spend every night wondering whether you're enough for someone who keeps making you question it. You would rather lose someone's attention than lose your identity trying to keep it. That is when your confidence changes. Not the fake confidence where you pretend you don't care. The real kind, the kind that says, "I care, but I will not destroy myself to be chosen." And once you live from that place, you stop begging people to recognize your worth, because you finally understand that your worth was never waiting inside their hands to be given back to you. The moment you stop chasing people, you start discovering something you were too distracted to notice before. Not everyone who has access to you actually values your presence. Some people simply became comfortable with your availability. They knew you would always call first. They knew you would forgive quickly. They knew you would return after every argument. They knew that no matter how distant they became, you would eventually find a reason to reach out. So when you stop the entire dynamic changes. Not because you're playing games, not because you're trying to make anyone jealous, because you're finally removing the extra effort you were using to keep something alive. And then you get to see what remains when you stop carrying the relationship by yourself. Some people will suddenly notice your absence. Some won't. Some will ask why you've changed. Some will pretend they never cared. Some will come back with the same words they used before. And some will simply disappear. That last one can hurt the most, because sometimes you don't realize how one-sided a connection was until you stopped doing your part. You thought there was a bond. You thought there was mutual care. You thought the relationship had depth because you were constantly investing in it. Then you stop investing, and silence answers the question you were too afraid to ask. Who actually values me? The answer isn't always the person who says the nicest things. It's the person whose actions remain consistent when you're no longer chasing them. It's the person who checks on you without needing something. It's the person who notices when you're struggling instead of only noticing when you're useful. It's the person who doesn't require you to disappear before they remember your existence. Real value doesn't need to be forced. You shouldn't have to constantly remind someone that you exist. You shouldn't have to compete for basic consideration. You shouldn't have to become more impressive, more successful, more attractive, more mysterious, or more distant just to make someone finally appreciate you. If someone only values your presence after losing access to it, you have to ask yourself whether they valued you or simply valued what you provided. That's a painful distinction. But pain doesn't make the truth less valuable. Sometimes you need to lose someone's attention to understand how much of your identity was built around receiving it. You start asking different questions. Was I actually loved, or was I simply convenient? Did they appreciate me, or did they appreciate what I did for them? Did they miss me, or did they miss the attention I constantly gave them? Did they want me, or did they want the version of me that never said no? Those questions can destroy illusions you spent years protecting, but they can also give you your freedom back. Because once you understand someone's behavior, you don't have to keep arguing with it. You don't need to convince them to care. You don't need to prove that you're worth keeping. You don't need to punish them for failing to appreciate you. You simply adjust your access. You stop giving premium energy to people offering minimum effort. You stop explaining your boundaries to people committed to crossing them. You stop giving endless opportunities to people who keep demonstrating the same pattern. And suddenly, your circle becomes smaller but clearer. You begin noticing the people who never demanded that you chase them, the people who stayed without needing to be begged, the people who respected your silence instead of taking advantage of it, the people who didn't disappear whenever you stopped being useful. Those people become easier to recognize because you're no longer distracted by everyone who makes noise. And that's the strange part. When you stop chasing the wrong people, you don't necessarily lose everyone. You finally create space for the right people to show themselves. Your standards become sharper. Your attention becomes more expensive. Your presence becomes something you give intentionally rather than automatically. You stop asking who needs you. You start asking who respects you. You stop asking who misses you. You start asking who treats you well while you're still there, because anyone can suddenly become emotional after losing access to you. Anyone can return when your absence becomes inconvenient. Anyone can say they didn't realize your importance. But consistency tells a different story. Actions reveal what words try to hide. And when you finally learn to watch actions instead of chasing explanations, you stop feeling confused by people who were never truly confusing in the first place, because they had been showing you exactly who they were, while you were too busy trying to convince them to become someone else. When you stop chasing people, something very strange happens to your energy. The same energy you were spending on getting replies, maintaining conversations, fixing relationships, proving your loyalty, and wondering why someone changed suddenly becomes available to you again. It was never gone. You were simply spending it in places that gave you nothing back. You were exhausting yourself trying to be remembered by people you should never have had to remind. You were spending hours thinking about someone who probably wasn't spending minutes thinking about you. You were carrying conversations that needed two people. You were protecting relationships that were already collapsing, and you called it effort. Maybe it was. But effort without direction can destroy you. The day you stop chasing, you begin redirecting that energy. You stop asking, why aren't they choosing me? You start asking, what could I build if I stopped waiting for them? That question changes the entire atmosphere of your life. Suddenly, your morning isn't controlled by a notification. Your mood isn't controlled by someone's reply. Your confidence isn't controlled by someone's attention. Your schedule isn't built around someone else's availability. You begin taking your energy back piece by piece. You put it into your work, your health, your goals, your skills, your discipline, your future. You start realizing that every minute spent obsessing over someone is a minute you could have spent becoming someone you wouldn't recognize a year from now. And that's when the mindset becomes darker in a different way. You become obsessed with your own development instead of someone else's reaction, not in a desperate way, in a disciplined way. You don't need everyone to know what you're doing. You don't need applause while you're building. You don't need to announce every improvement. You just wake up and work. You read, you learn, you train, you create, you recover, you improve. And while other people are wondering why you've become quiet, you're finally hearing yourself think. That silence becomes productive. You start noticing things about yourself that were buried under emotional noise. You discover what you actually want. You discover what you tolerate. You discover where you have been wasting time. You discover how often you abandoned your own priorities just to be available for somebody else. And maybe the hardest realization is this: you weren't always tired because life was difficult. Sometimes you were tired because you were constantly trying to manage other people's opinions, moods, expectations, and decisions. That's exhausting. You cannot control who stays. You cannot control who changes. You cannot control who chooses you. But you can control what you do with the energy you have left. And once you understand that, your life starts moving differently. You stop checking behind you. You stop wondering whether they noticed your progress. You stop building a better life just so someone regrets losing you. That is still chasing. You build because you want the life, You improve because you respect yourself. You become disciplined because you are tired of being controlled by temporary emotions. You become stronger because you finally understand that your future deserves more attention than your past. And then something beautiful happens. The people who once occupied your entire mind begin taking up less space. Not because you forced yourself to forget them, because you finally filled that space with something more meaningful. Your goals become louder than their silence. Your progress becomes louder than their rejection. Your peace becomes louder than their absence. You don't need revenge. You don't need to make them jealous. You don't need to prove that you're doing better. Your life becomes the proof. And when your attention returns to your own life, you become more difficult to distract. Someone ignores you. You continue. Someone criticizes you. You evaluate it and continue. Someone leaves. You grieve and continue. Someone comes back. You decide whether they deserve access instead of automatically opening the door. That is what happens when your energy belongs to you again. You become less reactive, more focused, more patient, more selective. You stop living from emotional impulse and start living from intention. And suddenly, the person you were desperately trying to impress becomes less important than the person you are becoming. That's the real transformation. You don't become powerful because people finally notice you. You become powerful because you stop needing them to notice you. You stop waiting for permission to grow. You stop waiting for somebody to validate your potential. You stop waiting for an apology before moving forward. You stop waiting for someone to recognize your value before you recognize it yourself. Your energy becomes an investment, and you become much more careful about where you spend it, because once you realize how expensive your attention really is, you stop giving it away to anyone who knows how to ask, but never knows how to give anything back. The real shift happens when you stop chasing what doesn't choose you. Not because you suddenly stop caring about people, but because you finally understand that your life cannot be built around convincing someone to stay. There is a difference between fighting for something meaningful and desperately holding onto something that has already decided to leave. You can spend months trying to keep a person close, changing your behavior, lowering your standards, becoming more available, answering instantly, forgiving repeatedly, and pretending that certain things don't hurt. You can become the easiest person in the world to keep around and somehow still feel like you're constantly being abandoned. That's when you have to ask yourself a brutal question. What exactly are you chasing?
A person?
Or the feeling of finally being chosen? Because sometimes you're not chasing the person anymore. You're chasing validation. You're chasing the moment when they finally look at you and say, "You're important to me." And if someone has to be convinced to say that, you've already learned something important. You don't need to chase what genuinely chooses you. The right people won't require you to constantly prove that you deserve a place in their lives. They won't make you compete for basic respect. They won't keep you trapped in a cycle where you are always wondering whether you're enough. And no, that doesn't mean healthy relationships never have problems. They do. People misunderstand each other. People get busy. People need space. People make mistakes. But there is a difference between temporary distance and a permanent pattern of indifference. Your job isn't to chase every person who becomes distant. Your job is to observe. Watch the pattern. Watch the effort. Watch what happens when you stop doing all the work, because sometimes the fastest way to understand someone's priorities is to stop making yourself their priority. You don't need to create a dramatic disappearance. You don't need to announce that you're leaving. You don't need to post mysterious messages hoping someone will notice. Just become honest with yourself. If you're always initiating, always repairing, always apologizing, always forgiving, always waiting, always wondering, then maybe the connection isn't balanced. And an unbalanced relationship will eventually make you question your own worth. That's where you have to draw the line, not with anger, with clarity. You can say, I care about you, but I won't chase you. You can say, I appreciate what we had, but I won't keep forcing something that isn't mutual. You can say nothing at all and simply change your behavior. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the moment you stop negotiating against yourself. You stop chasing because you finally understand that being chosen means more when the choice is freely given. If someone wants to be in your life, let their actions demonstrate it. If they don't, let their absence speak without turning it into a personal attack. You don't have to hate them. You don't have to expose them. You don't have to make them regret anything. You just keep moving. That's the part people underestimate. Moving forward doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like waking up and not checking your phone. Sometimes it looks like deleting the draft you were about to send. Sometimes it looks like refusing to revisit the same argument for the 10th time. Sometimes it looks like putting your attention back into your goals. Sometimes it looks like realizing that peace feels unfamiliar because chaos had become your normal. And slowly, you become comfortable with your own company. You begin enjoying your own life without needing someone else to constantly confirm that it matters. You start building a mindset where your standards aren't determined by who wants you. You don't become arrogant. You become grounded. You understand that rejection is information, not a sentence. Someone not choosing you doesn't mean nobody will. Someone leaving doesn't mean you're impossible to love. Someone losing interest doesn't mean you have lost your value. It simply means the connection wasn't what you wanted it to be. And that's okay, because your future should not be held hostage by somebody else's decision. You have places to go, things to build, lessons to learn, parts of yourself you haven't even discovered yet. The world doesn't stop because someone walked away. Your potential doesn't disappear because someone failed to recognize it. Your story doesn't end because a chapter closed. And once you truly understand that, chasing begins to feel ridiculous. Why run after something that keeps running away? Why beg for attention that should be given naturally? Why keep knocking on a door when you've already been shown that nobody wants to open it? Walk away, not to punish them. Walk away to protect the person you are becoming, because eventually you will look back and realize that the moment you stopped chasing wasn't the moment you lost them. It was the moment you finally stopped losing yourself, and that is where your entire mindset begins to change.